Well, we have another Transatlantic Trends poll for you, if we can get that up on the, there we go. And this Trends poll, again, this is from the Bertelsmann Foundation as well as the German Marshall Fund, done on both sides of the Atlantic, this Transatlantic Trends poll. It shows that majorities on both sides of the Atlantic see Chinese influence in global affairs as negative. Well, but why? Our final panel today, ending this program, it's a panel discussion offering some insights. The session will look at China and the notion of China's splendid isolation. It's a concept you may already be familiar with. But before that gets underway, I just want to say at this point, thank you. It's been my pleasure being with you. I'm going to bow out at this point. After this session, we're going to have Katarzyna Pisarska back up with you, who has done an amazing job putting this whole Warsaw Security Forum together. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce someone whose judgment and insights I've valued now for years, particularly on China, the wonderful Theresa Fallon, the founder and director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Hello, I'm so glad that you're here still. We saved the best for last, and I'm so delighted to see you here for this very important panel. We're going to dive right in. I know that's been a long 2 days, but China has been so much in the news. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, how many of you heard of this before? I think I've never seen so many people pay attention to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that happened recently in Uzbekistan, precisely because of the optics between Russia and China, the Xi-Putin meeting. So I think the world is really engaged on what this means in this region, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. We understand that Russia and China, everyone's trying to tease out what type of relationship they have, and what does this mean for security issues as well, especially in regard to Ukraine and the war that's taking place there. So let's begin our discussion. We have an excellent panel here. I'm going to start off with Reinhard Bütikofer, who's an expert on transatlantic relations and Russia and China, US relations. So can you give us a state of play of how you see the landscape right now?
Thank you first for having me. I do believe that we're just experiencing a very historic moment in the developing of China's international role. The no limits friendship that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin signed at the beginning of February amounts to a revisionist pact that aims for overturning the international order and creating a post-Westphalian order where authoritarian regimes would dominate global relations. China has been more aggressive with its foreign policy over the last years than we used to know from them, and I don't see any change coming anytime soon. A few weeks from today, in fact, on the 16th of October, the CCP will organize its 20th party conference, and Xi Jinping will be crowned party emperor for life. And I think he will double down on absolute control domestically and an aggressive policy where they don't aim for self-isolation. They aim for constructing an alternative system of international relations that would put them at the center of the global stage.
Thank you very much. This kind of follows up naturally for what's happening to Lithuania. It's a country that has experienced China's economic coercion. You've been on the front line. Now it's called the 14+1, but originally it was the 16+1. It's a sub-regional grouping of Central Eastern European countries. Please tell us how you see the landscape right now.
So first of all, I want to apologize to everyone. I had a very bad case of COVID, and now I have a temporary memory glitches, so that's the notes, sorry. But talking about Lithuania, yes, we disrupted that regional format, 17+1, which in the essence was not actually for cooperation. It was one of the long-term strategies of China to divide the European Union. So of course there could be only one format, European Union format. So Lithuania left it, and then Latvia and Estonia left it, and I'm hoping that instead of 14+1, it will cease to exist like this. But we had a very consistent and systematic approach towards China as a threat, because our institutions, our special services and intelligence agencies have been telling for years that China is a threat. So first we limited their ability to invest and control into our critical infrastructure. Look at Greece, the seaport of Petraeus, what happened there. So we had lessons to learn. Then ability of them to expand 5G network based on Huawei technologies, because they always have backdoors. And if you want to broadcast all your information to China, hello, you are welcome there. And then my resolution on Uyghur genocide, as a co-chair and one of co-founders of IPAC, Interparliamentary Alliance on China, I was really happy to sponsor it, and I got the honor badge sanctioned by China. And then of course our Taiwanese representative office in Lithuania and our discussion about the name of that office. So how we're doing? We're doing okay. We have partners, we have understanding from European Commission, and even though I'd say as a Lithuanian, because we're stubborn and very direct people, in the beginning there was confusion, but now I think everybody has this wake-up call that China is going to get more and more aggressive, and globally, China's threat is no less than Russia's.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Uli now. I had the opportunity to live both in Russia and China, and I did that back to back. Some analysts have described the current situation between Xi and Putin as being handcuffed to a corpse. Maybe you can describe how you see, from Germany's point of view, how this Russia-China relationship is working out.
Well, thank you very much. At first, China's plans are deeply disturbed by the war that's not been won by Putin, and the friendship between the two that was built in 200 hours, I believe, on 39 meetings they had together. That's something special in international relations. And we remember the times when KPC or the KP of the USSR were enemies in a way, and now they turned to a friendship. They reduced border control, they made maneuvers in the region, and so China has a friendship with Russia, but the plans of China are disturbed. So Xi was on a slow path to get the new superpower in Asia, and he wanted to get the #1 place in the world. And I think there was an insurance made on the visit that Putin has to Beijing in front of the Olympic Games, and that insurance was only for the moment when the war wouldn't go the way he thought it would be. So everybody thinks that 2 weeks in between Olympic Games and Paralympics were the time when Ukraine should have fallen, and then they would have been combined with the Belarusian Union, and at that moment everything would be fine and China could go onwards, going on Taiwan and all that. And the insurance is now taken, and Xi realized that that's not good for his standing in the world, for his economy. He relies on the economy. His nationalism in China relies on that economy, and that's what I see as the point of the going down of the friendship between the two, because the long-term plans from China are not functioning with Russia, with Vladimir Putin anymore.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to General Petraeus with your expertise in Central Asia. How do you see the balance now playing out between Russia and China? Because we saw the Global Security Initiative being pushed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Putin is really kind of diminished. Uli mentioned the February 4th no limits agreement that was signed before the Olympics, and everyone was very deeply concerned about that. And now, fast forward to just a few months later, and Putin, the timing couldn't have been worse. He looked so weak. People were disrespecting him, showing up late for meetings. How do you see this play out, and what will that mean for the bigger geopolitical picture?
Well, let me start, I guess, with very quickly, the China-Russia relationship, then Central Asian states, and then let me give it some global perspective. But first, let me just note that I salute everyone who is still here in the seats. You get an A+, big time for effort. And we recognize that we are all that stand between you and a beer at the final reception. So don't worry, the clock is ticking down. 26 minutes and 21 seconds. First of all, I think you characterize the relationship between President Putin and President Xi just right. Yes, it was announced as a partnership without limits, but it's very clear there are limits. China has not, for example, unfrozen the $300 billion worth of foreign reserves that are in China that Russia has there. Remember, Russia tried to de-risk itself by placing $600 billion of foreign reserves around the world, never thinking that everyone would actually freeze those. They have, including China. China has also not sold them any kind of military hardware, microchips. They have not violated that export control established by the US and others. So there are very distinct limits, and I think it really shows that in truth, this relationship is not one between equals. This is a transactional relationship. China is happy to buy natural gas from Russia, especially when the price is down. It's happy to, again, get other energy resources and so forth. But at the end of the day, again, they're not going to be there for Russia when the going really gets tough, and they have not been. And in fact, President Xi clearly, as did Prime Minister Modi, expressed reservations, concerns, challenges that, in fact, President Putin had to acknowledge when they had their summit meeting. The Central Asian states, I think, quite clearly are drawing back a bit from Russia. It's very instructive to see Kazakhstan, which welcomed Russian paratroopers into Almaty when they had demonstrations right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but since then has actually drawn back and again has also sought not to get involved in Ukraine and has concerns about what is going on, needless to say. But if we put it in perspective, and I think this is actually very important, perhaps as a final session for this particular forum, which understandably has been preoccupied, as all of us have, with the situation in Ukraine, Russia's unprovoked invasion, and the extraordinary performance of the Ukrainian armed forces and people. It's worth remembering that, especially perhaps arguably from a US perspective, I am American after all, the US is like the guy in the circus who has to get a lot of plates spinning and keep them all spinning. So there is a China plate, there's a Russia plate. These are all the challenges, if you will. And there are innumerable challenges, and they're each represented, if you will, in this metaphorical image of the guy who gets a plate spinning. There's a North Korea plate. The Russia plate's gotten much bigger. It's much more pronounced. It's much more urgent right now, but there's an Iran plate, perhaps Iran plates, because there are different threats that it poses. There are still individual plates that represent the individual Islamist extremist groups that are still active in various parts of the world. There are cyber threat plates. Again, the list goes on. There's even a domestic populism issue, as the previous panel discussed. But the China plate is bigger and more important than all of the other plates put together. It can never be allowed to fall. Now, the US has allies and partners, and again, great to see the EU response as it has drawn together. And this is therefore the objective of this administration in particular, but really of the US in a bipartisan fashion, is to have a comprehensive, integrated whole of governments, with an S on the end, because again, all the allies and partners, approach to China, most significantly to deter, to dissuade the policymakers in Beijing from ever taking a decision that could result in actual conflict. That is crucial, and we're very seized with that. The key is deterrence. That rests on two elements. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities. We're working hard to transform those together with allies and partners, and then the willingness to employ those capabilities, which we're also seeking to demonstrate. And frankly, the response to Ukraine has been quite impressive in that regard, I think. But that perspective, I think, is actually really, really important, even maybe especially at a conference which is so seized with the issue that is so nearby. But nonetheless, the big issue facing the world is the relationship, most significantly of the US, but also then the EU and all other countries with China, and making sure that that relationship never evolves into conflict.
Buti, I see you nodding your head, and I'm reminded that the title is The Changing Transatlantic Landscape and Worldwide Interests. And I looked at your blog, and you wrote about the TTC. And how do you see transatlantic relations evolving in regard to China? Because there seems to be a desire to coordinate economically and to kind of not share certain technologies with Beijing. How is that going in your point of view?
Well, we had a wonderful period of globalism in the last 3 decades arising, and so all the economy of the world made a big of boundary. So Germany is involved on the Chinese market with big players like Volkswagen or BMW. On the one side, it's part of markets, so we have big economic relations with the US as European Union, but also with China. But talking about system rivalry, we are, out of my opinion, right in a system war already. And we have transatlantic relations, NATO. The US helped Europe after the Second World War. It helped Germany to become that country of freedom and democracy that we are today. And I don't want to live in a Chinese-ruled world with a social credit system and all that stuff. And I want to be in a democratic, free world. And so, you see, what I would like to say is that if US has to go to conflict with China, NATO is, out of my opinion, not one way. It's also in the other way around. So if China takes US into a conflict, or China is installing nukes, 250 nukes are new installed, who have arranged to reach Washington, D.C. I always tell the people, if you can reach Washington, D.C. by China, you can reach every point in Europe as well. And so we are all endangered by what's happening right now. And that's my answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. General Petraeus gave me a two-finger. We'll keep it short and sharp because the clock is ticking by. And if you want to jump in as well, just give me a signal.
I think the biggest geopolitical development of the past decade, at the least, if not a little bit longer, has been the evolution of the world from one that could be described as an era of benign globalization, in which economics largely determined geopolitics, to an era of renewed great power rivalries in which geopolitics are largely determining economics, are constraining it. And I don't say that just because I'm the chairman of the KKR Global Institute, but we have seen this transform during my 9+ years at KKR, where geopolitics are now becoming vastly more important in every investment opportunity that we examine.
I would agree with that 100%, but I don't think that transatlantic partners are fully living up to that analysis. There are positive efforts like the Trade and Tech Council, or that we coordinate efforts to get the right candidates elected at the helm of international institutions and organizations, but there are also obvious downsides. Look at the recent legislation in the US, the IRA. It's a great example of protectionism and economic nationalism, and it hurts transatlantic cooperation. If we want to stand up to China, we have to work together. And that implies that we need each other. We around Europe have known for 70 years that we can't stand tall without the United States. But in the present day and age, the US will not win the race with the Chinese without teaming up with the allies. If you want to team up with allies, you have to play a partnership game, and not a nationalist and protectionist game. So we're not fully where we should be.
I couldn't agree more with Reinhard, and to say frankly, I've been saying a couple of years that China, as a long-term player, long strategy player, as different from us on our short political cycles, we can't see more than, 4 or 5 years, depending on the country. China is taking notes on what Russia is going to do with Ukraine. And our main, winning point is that we, as it was told during those 2 days numerous times, surprised even ourselves by being able to play as a team. We have to play as a team regarding China as well, and I agree with Reinhard. Because, again, what will happen to Taiwan is being decided now in Ukraine. Because it's not only about the victory, about weakening of the main imperialistic, genocidal, murdering state in our region, Russia, but it is also the instruction for China. Is it going to be too painful? Is it going to be efficient? Are we going to finally move from punishment to denial? That's the most important thing. And then when we look at the strategy of China, if I can run ahead a little bit because the time is pressing us, China is actually very successfully using the war in Ukraine for its alternative strategy, this so-called string of pearls, which is going to suffocate Europe and Asia and Africa. And from Djibouti to Equatorial Guinea to Pakistan to Greece Petraeus seaport, and again, hello my unhappy COVID, to Sri Lanka, to Solomon Islands. This string of pearls is being constructed right now. And just to mention some very cool moments, when they are parading their really heavily militarized intelligence ships in some seaports where, for example, India is heavily protesting that, but how many of us are talking about it? How many of us understand that now we are in an even bigger teamwork, democracy against autocracy, and there are countries that are sitting on the fence. So yes, let's not forget another huge player, India, which is now sitting on the fence because 65% of their arms are made in Russia. But if Russian military industry collapses, then it could be a chance for us to get India off of the fence. So yes, let's not be naive. It's not regional, and it's not like United States and China. Now, the fate of all our world is being decided for at least a decade.
It's a really good point where I would like to add something. You mentioned 16+1. It's 16 because Lithuania left that group. And I can only tell the people, think about what's happening. We have to be on a one Europe policy against a one China policy. If somebody of us is attacked by China in the European Union, it's our part to stand together and tell China, no, that's not possible. We are not a club of 27 who is just there for the good times, but also for the bad times. And that's something we approving right now in our support for Ukraine.
And just a quick note, because I heard some noises in the audience. It was 17+1 when Greece joined. It went from 16 to 17. Lithuania was the first country to leave, and then we've seen the Baltics leave. And I have good rumors in Brussels that 2 more are going to be leaving soon, so it'll be 12+1. So I think the Chinese perhaps learned a lesson: never put a number on these organizations because it becomes a barometer of relations. So, but what I wanted to talk about also on this, because Beijing, the idea of Halford Mackinder's historical pivot, a geopolitical paper published in 1904, the Chinese, to my mind, really take this seriously. That's why they tried to create this sub-regional grouping, because I really feel that whoever controls Eastern Europe controls the island, the continent. So they really invested this idea, but it hasn't proved, it was over-promising and under-delivering. Nevertheless, everyone's watching quite closely now, because after Ukraine, there seemed to be a big break with Europe and China. So many people are concerned, perhaps by a rapprochement. China is going to start traveling again. Chinese diplomats will be making a lot of visits to Europe, trying to patch things up. How do you see that? And in addition, there's lots of rumors circulating in Brussels that both Macron and Scholz will be traveling to Beijing. How is that going to affect EU policy? Because we know that China's strategy is always to try to drive wedges in the transatlantic relationship. And economics will be very key in all of this, especially in a post-COVID, inflation, high energy landscape. So how are we going to be able to keep the EU all together? Who wants to grab that one? Okay, Reinhard.
Well, President Biden talks to Xi, so why should Scholz and Macron not talk to him? The question is not whether they talk, but what they say. And if they stick to a good balance of dialogue and deterrence, I'm all for it. And I believe indeed that this is something where Europe should play a role, deterring China against an aggressive course that the country seems to be about to pursue even more strongly than they have. Everybody has heard President Biden saying 4 times that the US would come to the defense of Taiwan. Every single time his administration has corrected his remarks. But even if you're a very gaffe-prone person, you don't put your foot in the mouth 4 times just the same way. So that is indeed signaling a change of policy. And I think that's adequate. Because when the policy of strategic ambiguity was developed decades ago, the military balance between Taiwan and China was very different from what it is today. If the US would not come to the support of Taiwan in the case of an attack, Taiwan would fall into the lap of Xi Jinping. And that would be the end of any credibility of the United States as an ally and guarantor of peace and stability around the globe. Because of that, Japan is also moving. And I believe, and Australia is going to move. And I believe Europe should also move. Now, I don't foresee a really relevant military role that we could play, but we should develop a policy of deterrence in the economic and in the political sphere, and that, of course, presupposes that we get rid of some of the dependencies that we have developed. If a German company rakes 50% of its profits and does 40% of its turnover in China, they have put too many eggs into that one basket. That's a dependency we cannot allow ourselves to be subjected to. So I think there's a lot to do where Europe has to play a role. And I don't subscribe to a theory that I often hear that the European task would be limited to the European subcontinent, and we should watch what Russia does and leave the Indo-Pacific to the United States. I think Europe should also play a role in the Indo-Pacific.
No, I agree with you, and we've seen Indo-Pacific strategy at the EU level. Germany has updated theirs, even France, the Netherlands, they all have an Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think that this is a really positive development. And in addition, Czech Republic, which is a landlocked country, one of the things that they're promoting during their EU rotating presidency is Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think We're seeing consistency from the French, now the Czech presidency, and then the next presidency will be Sweden, and they are also picking up the Indo-Pacific thread. So I think it's quite clear that Europe sees this as very important. And I just want to pick up on your point about first time as a gaffe when President Biden talked about Taiwan. Fourth is a policy, 4 times saying, so we call it gaffe ambiguity. Gaffe ambiguity, I think we can try to coin a new term. But I think you wanted to chime in there.
Well, actually, talking to a genocidal emperor, I think, is very risky. So then again, to be very direct, it's very important not to make the mistake which was made with Russia, believing that there can be an agreement with genocidal murderer, because that's who they are. And the states themselves are like this. And based on that, I just think that we need to have in our heads a warning that some people believed that there could be agreement with Russia, well, maybe from some of our American friends, agreement with Russia to have them at least not on China's side when the global conflict erupts. But I think that's as naive as thinking that maybe we could have China not at least on Russia's side if the conflict develops further. Because so far, and let me tell that also openly, Russia has been wonderfully synchronizing with China. China has grand strategies, Russia has none. Russia is a street fighter. So whenever China needs something, from Global Development Initiative, which then turned to Global Security Initiative, Russia barks like a dog in all international organizations, disrupts the process, makes chaos, and etc. They are synchronizing. Let's not be naive.
I would also challenge a little bit the assumption that because Xi Jinping is unhappy with the lack of success of the Russian aggression, that he would be moving away from Putin strategically. I don't believe that for a second. Their alliance is built on mutual benefit and shared grievance, and it is designed to create a new world order. That is, as the NATO strategy says, posing dangers to our interests, us, our values, and our democratic way of life. And tactically, they operate differently. China has many more tools than Russia has. Russia just has a military. China has an economy and all that. And they're not marching in lockstep. But whenever they disagree tactically, and China doesn't want to pay a high price for backing up Putin, we should not be deluded into believing that they're not strategic allies.
Exactly. I think that one phrase that Putin read from a card, so clearly he was told to read it, stating that he understood that China had concerns, made the media go crazy, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's a rift. But I don't think that's the case at all. That's all it took for people to see some daylight between Russia and China, which is what they want in some areas, especially in Europe. They want them to think that there's some sort of a rift in order to claw back more influence. But I think that they agree to disagree on certain areas, but they have a greater goal together strategically to kind of change the system and work. It's better for China to have Russia in the tent than outside the tent, because Russia is a huge disruptor. So we have just a few moments left. Why don't we go through and give us your last comments?
Well, it's obvious that the partnership between Russia and China has developed over decades. We saw that on Security Council in the last years, on the UN system. We saw that on the project they had in Venezuela, when China was financing and Russia was defending Maduro. At that conflict, we saw it in the emergence of the BRICS partnership. We saw it on the Asian Development Bank and all that stuff that was done, and also on the same financing system they tried to raise up, so having something against SWIFT. So I don't see that is all broken away, but China is not pleased that their plans are disturbed too early. So I think that it would have been fine if Ukraine would have fallen in 2 weeks and everything would have been good between the two of them. But now China has to find a way to cope with the situation, but don't want to let loose of Russia. But a weakened junior partner, Russia, with all the resources on stage for China's hunger on resources and economical development, that's a wonderful situation for Xi.
General Petraeus.
Let me make 3 points if I could. The first is that I think it should be very clear, at least clearly stated, that there is bipartisan support in Washington for the policy on China that began with the previous administration and has continued in this administration. This is one of those issues in an increasingly partisan city on which there is bipartisan agreement. Ukraine would be another example, I would submit. The second is that when I describe the comprehensive approach, one of the elements which didn't come out here that I think is hugely important and that involves very significantly the US and EU and UK and then others in the Indo-Pacific, Japan in particular, is that we need to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. You mentioned the String of Pearls, of course, the land, that's the maritime activity. On the ground, it is, again, the Belt and Road connecting Asia with Europe. We need to compete and we need to do it together because that's the only way we can generate the resources that can truly compete. And it should be that promotes our values, our traditions and so forth. And then the third, I strongly agree that what happens in Ukraine will reverberate very significantly throughout the Indo-Pacific. The unfortunate withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way that was conducted was seized by President Xi personally as an example that the US was not a dependable partner. He stated that and that we were a great power in decline. I would contend that the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated exactly the opposite by all engaged, and we have to keep that in mind. It is hugely significant that the outcome in Ukraine is one of victory of democracy over kleptocracy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the audience. It was a shortened panel. I'm sorry about that, but I think that we have such great pros here. And we also have to keep in mind, we have the Party Congress coming up. Reinhard Bütikofer is going to have a panel on that, so tune in to that, please, for more information. And also, we should remember, this is an ideological battle. What was so interesting right before the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, number 3 person in the Chinese Communist Party, Li Jianshu, traveled to Moscow. And they tailored their message for different audiences. So on one hand, they're saying these things like, we have concerns, but then Li Jianshu, the Russians released the videotape of him speaking to the Duma saying, we're with you boys, we back you 100%. And so the Russians were rather annoyed by that. So we should also keep that in mind, that they tailored the message thinking that the door is closed and no one is really going to broadcast it. The Russians chose to broadcast it to show that the Chinese were behind them. But there's one little piece that wasn't even reported on. And Li Jianshu traveled to Lenin's the place where he died, the house that he died in, that's on the outskirts of Moscow. So it took time for him to go there. So I think the message is ideological, back for the domestic audience in China, saying, Russia is our ideological buddy. I mean, this is how the narrative that they're trying to shape. So I think, watch this page. Xi Jinping doesn't tweet. We don't know a whole lot about him, but everyone's trying to understand where China's going. We're going to have Xi Jinping, it appears, for quite some time. So thank you for your attention, and I'm so delighted that you're here. Let's give it a round of applause for Reinhard Bütikofer, Ulrich Lechte, General Petraeus, and Dovilė Šakalienė.